Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. In this hour, we're going to be speaking to Frank Hugenard about spontaneous healing beyond space and time. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. So if you've been thinking about becoming a medical intuitive counselor, or energy healer, this is the place to go to learn all of those skills and help you set up a practice of your own. appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. It's also brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. So today we're going to be speaking with Frank Hugenard about his film, Physics of the Soul. Sorry, but let me tell you a little bit about him and bring him on the air. Frank Hugenard is a science, spiritual anthropologist, humanitarian, and documentary filmmaker. His interest in consciousness and healing began almost 2 decades ago when his partner lost her battle with breast cancer. At the same time, he was also fired from his job in Silicon Valley for, quote-unquote, wasting company resources on a useless idea by inventing a video sharing and communication platform very similar to what Skype and YouTube are today. He was wasting their time and money. Okay. As a result, he lost everything: his stature in the community, his relationships, his home, his family, and his wealth. The upheaval ultimately sent him spiraling into a fundamental search for truth, the end result of which is a series of documentary films on science and consciousness. Please welcome to the show, Frank Hugenard. Hey, Frank.
Hey, Rita. Nice to talk to you again. Thanks for having me on.
It's nice talking to you again, too. And for
always a pleasure.
Anyone listening, Frank's been on the show before, and you might have to kind of dig through the archives because we have the new format, and you'd have to look him up under the past archives by name. But he's been on and talked about his earlier films, which the names are?
Beyond Reason, Beyond Belief, and Beyond Me.
And today we're talking about the physics of the soul, correct?
Correct. The Physics of the Soul is the first in a 5-part series on healing under the title of Beyond Space and Time. And it was all started just 1 year ago. Really, I wanted to look at, the kind of work you do, and frankly. And for the second or third film, I'll have to come to Texas and interview you.
You'll have to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, I have my house fixed up enough that I have, a fireplace with, a cool old sofa that I already know how I'll pose myself in the library, with the books, with the cool fireplace and everything. I'm set.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I can't wait to be there. I started a year ago working on what I thought would be a single film and really trying to break down, okay, when you do a healing and you use intuition to understand what the situation is, and you do some healing at a biophysiological level, what is happening? What can we look at scientifically and understand this? What can we do with our models to come up with a different model? And within the first 3 weeks, I'm not sure if any documentary film moved along as quickly as this one did. 6 people who I had previously asked to be in my previous films, who had either said no, or they were too busy, or they completely ignored me, all said yes within a week or two of me starting this a year ago. So it took off, and now it's going to be at least a series of 5 films.
Well, and why don't you go ahead and do a little name dropping, because I was very impressed with the people that did appear in this video. So maybe just do a little name dropping just to tantalize.
Well, yeah, sure. So we have I think the total number of books sold by the people in this film numbers over 100 million. We've got Gary Zukav, who's probably sold the most books. Larry Dawsey, Marilyn Schlitz have sold a lot of books on healing, and they've done a lot of research on prayer and healing. William Teller, of course, most people know. Stuart Hameroff, Bruce Lipton, I'm sure almost everybody in your audience must know Bruce, Lynn McTaggart. I mean, the list goes on and on. But to me, the real stars of the show are Bill Bankston, who's a doctor. Actually, he's a professor out of New York who's developed a healing modality that's amazing. And Garrett Modell, who's a materials physicist at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who really are unknowns relatively to most people. And they're actual scientists, so they bring that scientific discipline into the conversation.
And if I remember who you're talking about correctly, I thought that they were excellent because they brought in the science, but they also brought in the spiritual, and it was really nice to see from an academic, quote unquote, them being able to mix the two together.
Right, and this is, certainly no coincidence, although, I was amazingly blessed to stumble across both of these guys. But, anybody, and this comes out in the film, science, simply the way it's configured, the way it's defined, the way modern science has, the current paradigm that it's based on right now, this reductionistic, materialistic worldview doesn't work. You can
what do you mean? What is materialistic? What does that mean?
Right. It's basically the idea that you can figure out everything by reducing all of our theories and our knowledge down to the particle level. And you can look at, you can reduce things down to the smallest quanta and understand it just by looking at the physical nature of reality. And in spite of what the bleep and all these films and the quantum mechanics, for God's sakes, I've spoken with a lot of scientists over the last year who just will tell you that consciousness is created by electrical and chemical reactions in the brain. And it's the overwhelming majority of the worldview. But when you actually start doing the experiments, you look at, of course, what's done in the Pear Lab with Robert John and others, and of course, on the other end, what's done with prayer and all the studies that have been done with that, it breaks their concept of what materialism is. And so when you have scientists like Modell and Bankston who've gone across that gamut and realized, well, wait a second, everything we thought to be true about science is wrong, then there's only one inescapable conclusion, and that's really what comes out in the interviews.
I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. One of the things that I thought was interesting was this whole materialistic view that it has to be, that consciousness isn't involved. But then there's that whole branch, and I guess it's of physics, that talks about the observer, and that certain things happen and particles go a certain way based on the observer. But the observer isn't like pushing the particles, they're just there. I mean, which with their consciousness, obviously. Can't they add that into their equation? I mean, it seemed kind of obvious to me.
It's really strange. All of the founders of quantum mechanics, Wigner and of course Einstein and Heisenberg and who's the other guy, Niels Bohr. All of them, when they stumbled across the implications of quantum mechanics, all became very spiritual. They read Vedanta, and they just naturally understood. And so when I started actually my previous film, Beyond Reason, which is all about, is much more about quantum mechanics than this one is, I set out, I was like, okay, I'll just go and talk to a bunch of scientists about exactly what you just said. I couldn't find a single philosopher, a scientist who would acknowledge the fact that consciousness causes the so-called collapse of the wave function, which is what you're describing. Quantum mechanics now, by some estimates, accounts for 33% of the world economy. They've been able to take this technology. Yeah, let's forget about the implications of it, but let's just use, it's been the most successful scientific theory in the history of mankind because of what it's been able to do. But let's ignore the implications of it, and let's just go ahead and use the technology to go off and build, MRI machines and semiconductors and whatever else we need to do to use the knowledge. But scientists, by and large, just don't go there. I think it was Richard Feynman who said something like, mothers, don't let your children grow up to be quantum physicists because it'll drive them crazy.
Well, and I'm just laughing. And okay, so this is my professional opinion of why they don't want to go there. It's because they don't understand it, and it's all alien technology, and they don't really know how it works.
It's my brother's, he's a smart guy. He runs a lab, the Hugenard lab at Stanford, and he's trying to come up with a pharmaceutical solution for epilepsy. And I was kind of like, doing my thing, which is, hey, there's got to be an energetic solution. And he's like, Frank, have you ever seen someone suffer from an epileptic seizure? So I can understand his motivation. Like, he had a friend in high school who used to have these seizures, and so he's been driven his whole life to try to come up with a chemical-based solution. But I was in his house when I was out on the road doing this film, and there was this 25-year-old bright, enthusiastic, charismatic scientist, working on his PhD. And, he was comparing the human brain to the dishwasher, which happened to be being repaired at the time, and saying, yeah, it's just like that. We don't know if it's the thermostat or it's the solenoid, but you just go in there and you replace the part and you fix it, and then the brain starts working again. And oh my God, are you kidding me? You're an extraordinarily smart person, and after all of the discoveries made in quantum mechanics and modern physics over the last 100 years, scientists still have this worldview. It's mind blowing.
Well, and it's interesting because I've worked with people that are epileptic, and it really seems like there would be an energetic way to help them.
That's what I'm convinced of that, absolutely. And I actually was helping a friend recently, and she has a 10-year-old goddaughter, and so I sent her to an energetic healer friend of mine. And, it was interesting because what we discovered, and I kind of found this out just talking to the mom, just intuitively, it was the mother's energy field that was triggering the daughter's epileptic seizures. It was the mother who needed to have, those I don't know what those disturbances or imbalances in her energy field, those needed to be healed so that the daughter could stop having so many seizures.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, if you talk to her, you would see that I don't think it takes a psychic to talk to this mom and see, how wired she is and how she's what's the word, projecting so much of her own neuroses and anxieties onto the kid and just triggering these epileptic seizures one after another.
Well, and what's interesting, I think the word you use is really interesting. From an energetic place, at least in the library that I get shown, it looks like they have an electrical wire that's loose. And when they go into a seizure, the wire is flailing around and it's just hitting nerves. It's hitting other nerves and it's just making the body freak out. But if you can ground that wire out.
Right. You can ground the wire out. And also the other half of that is, what do you do to mitigate the problem in the first place so it happens fewer times and less intensely each time?
Anyway, the stuff of a different show.
Well, I have a feeling I'm going to be doing this for many, many years because basically you can put anything under the umbrella of healing. Just about anything that you've ever had on your show, some form, or, on any of these shows, in some form or another, has something to do with healing, either mentally or emotionally, physically, socially, and so on.
In your estimation, how much how much of the body do you think can be healed energetically, spiritually? I mean, in my belief system, if you break your leg, you break your leg. That you can use the healing to help it heal faster, et cetera, et cetera. But outside of that kind of trauma to the body, how much do you think that working with energy healing or spiritual healing can help a person experience spontaneous or radiant health?
About 99%, I think. I think that, certainly you've got some congenital conditions, you've got environmental causes for some things. So maybe 99 is a little bit of hyperbole, but it's certainly huge. And, you look at different traditions around the world and how Western medicine, which, if you noticed in my film and all my films, I really avoid as best I can to bash anybody or anything. I think that's kind of a useless thing. But one of the things about Western medicine, there's 6 stages of an illness, and Western medicine is only capable of seeing the last 3, 4, 5, and 6 stages. And at that point, this is why our hospitals are so high and our insurance costs are through the roof and our medical costs, because by the time Western medicine even recognizes there's something wrong, it's developed symptomatically into the body, to the point where it needs a lot of remediation. Whereas other types of healing modalities, most of them that are energetic, can catch these things way before they even become symptoms. So I think almost everything can be healed energetically.
Excuse me, I need you to cough. All right, talk for a second, Frank, because I need to cough more.
Okay, go ahead and cough. I'll just keep blathering on here. Not sure exactly what to say. I can talk about the next film in the series, which is going to focus a lot on what I call spiritual anatomy. And so this first film really puts forward the argument that we can talk about this in a scientific framework. And in order to do that, we have to basically change the models of what science basically can talk about or not, and bring science, actually bring consciousness into the equation. So the models that are being presented will include consciousness in some form. And then this next film I'll be working on in the next year is going to be focusing on putting basically a big thumbprint on the body and how the energetic systems, the chakras, the subtle energy fields, interrelate directly with the different organisms and glands of the body.
Cool. Well, one of the things that Gary Zukav talked about at the beginning of the movie is that we're experiencing a world, we're starting to experience, which I disagree with, but we're experiencing a world beyond the 5 senses. Do you think it's, based on his comment, that it's a shift that's happening within us, or that it's more that we're recognizing what's innate within us already?
Well, Gary makes the point in the film, in a subsequent clip, that, where he's talking about empirical science being a relatively small blip, basically, on the radar over the last, several thousand years. And that over the last, and Marilyn speaks about this, and Larry Dossi does as well, that because of just sort of the history of the church and the scientific community and discoveries and Sir Francis Bacon and, the new methodology, where there became a schism between, science and the church, that empirical and 5-sensory science has been around for just a very short period of time, and that we had always been more of a spiritual being in the past, and we're going to. I love what Garrett Modell says near the end of the film with his jazz analogy, where we had always been consciousness based. Now that we've taken a look at science, we understand things at the physical level better than we ever have. And yet we're going back to a consciousness-based reality, but we understand the physics at a much deeper level. And I think Gary was saying that as well.
Well, and I agree. I think that now we can put words to the phenomena that's happening, even though we don't necessarily understand exactly what's happening. I think we have a better grasp, or at least a notion of what's going on, even though I do joke around and tell people we'll just get a couple of metaphysical books and it'll explain the whole quantum theory to you right there. But it wasn't until, you read a lot of ancient texts or old texts and stuff, and it's very cryptic in that way. And I think with the science that has been studying it, it has made it be more understandable,
right? And this
to the
is
regular person.
And this is a huge focus of what I'm going to be doing going forward, which is to try to be scientific about the whole thing, which means being an anthropologist and going back and reading Upanishads and going and studying with a kahuna or a Tibetan monk and reading the Torah and the Quran and learning about quantum mechanics and distilling out the common. If we're going to assume that consciousness is primary to existence, that it is indeed fundamental to our experience, to in fact creation, and then we take it, and so we say, okay, science is good to a point, but we have to expand science to include consciousness. How are we going to do that? Well, it's a scientific process to go back through all the literature, all the ancient scriptures, anything that's been written with this idea that we're going to distill out the common information from all of these ancient texts, combine that with our knowledge of medicine and technology and quantum mechanics, and resynthesize all the information into a new form of science that can take all of the stuff into account. That's a scientific process.
So I guess you need to have Amit Goswami in your film then.
I may have him. He was. I should have given him a call when I was up in Oregon. He's
great. You'll love him. You'll totally love him.
He's phenomenal. What I really need for my next production is, and I'm just assuming this is going to happen because I've never been supported in my life the way that I have been on this film, but I want to really develop a significant quantity of computer-generated animated graphics to really illustrate to people. There's this expression you've heard, everyone in your audience has heard from, I believe it was Pierre Desjardins, we're not humans having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a human experience. Well, what does that look like? What does a spiritual being actually look like? And how does that relate to the chakras? And how do the chakras actually relate to the physical body? There has to be some biotransceiver, some connection in the body that physically connects to these other fields. And so, moving forward, I think a lot of my emphasis will be trying to illustrate this in computer-generated graphics to show people, dynamically, what does it look like to have your chakras open or closed, or what are the nadis, and how is it that a good, practitioner can do a pulse diagnosis on you and tell you something about your mother's liver? I mean, these things are all real phenomena that have been studied, but how are they working? And so, this is really what I want to bring out in the next few films and show people that they can just watch them and say, oh, that's who we are. This is what it means to be human.
Why do you think scientists have such heartache about validating and understanding a world that lives outside of, and I'm putting this in quotes, controlled studies?
It's an interesting and very complicated and very, to me, fascinating question, and it's not easy to answer. It's taken hundreds and hundreds of years. You look at, Galileo and Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton, and all these people were devoutly spiritual people. So it really wasn't when the church broke off from Descartes and the Cartesian split happened. Most scientists back then, this is the 1700s, most of them were very religious people. But gradually over time, Lamarck was a vitalist. And vitalism was still fairly much in vogue throughout the 1800s. And vitalism, for those who don't know, just is the sense that there's a vital energy force. There's, prana or chi or mana, or all these are forms of vitalism that are prominent in most traditions around the world and always have been. But by the 1930s and 40s, it became a pejorative. If you wanted to insult the scientist, you called him a vitalist. And this whole, the way that the whole herd mentality of how science actually evolved, there was something in the 1930s that happened, which is that all the money dried up, and almost the entire funding that went into the scientific community, I believe, came through the Rockefeller Foundation. And so what kind of experiments were they funding? They were funding, the kinds of things that they believed in. And that really formed, it's shocking how much that formed the sociology of science for the next 50, 60, 70 years. I have this idea. I want to start a class action lawsuit against the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation to stop having them fund any more science experiments on the grounds of separation of church and state. And that might sound a little bit crazy, but I think a good lawyer can actually make a convincing, cogent argument for how this is what's happening. I mean, the NSF and the NIH are only funding experiments that are controlled studies. They won't touch any of this other stuff. And the scientific community really needs a wake-up call. The data's out there. All the data that Garrett Modell and Bangston and all these and Larry Dawsey talk about in the film is out there published. And yet if you go talk to any scientist, they just will not accept it. Garrett Modell's a professor in Boulder, and everyone who takes his class, he makes them do, experiments with random number generators. It's like, sure, you want to be a scientist, fine, but let me show you something first, which is outside of space and time. And these experiments will show you that, yes, we can understand materials and be materials physicists, but there's something beyond what science can study that has to be accounted for. Or at least at a minimum, you have to understand when you're taking on controlled experiments that they don't cover the whole picture.
Well, and that was one of the things, one of my takeaways from the movie, because as a practitioner, I've always been led to believe that there really weren't any studies done, or the studies were kind of half-baked. I mean, I know that William Tiller had been doing a bunch of work because I kind of follow his work. But after that, not so much. And to hear that there have been all of these studies done, and they're accredited studies through, they have their provenance, was kind of shocking to me.
Right. Well, see, that's just it, Rita. If they're shocking to you, how is it that this PhD candidate at Stanford would know anything about this? I was explaining to him this psychic experience I had when I was 12. I was delivering newspapers with my brother, and we were doing the same route, but he was on the next block over, and I had this vision that he got mauled by a dog. And 10 minutes later, sure enough, he came around the corner and he was holding his arm, and he got mauled by a dog. And this scientist heard the story, and he couldn't even. He kept throwing out these, well, maybe you saw the dog before, and it was your imagination. It's like I had never even been there before. Like, he just couldn't accept that I was able to have this experience, and I've had them my whole life. So, and I went into the interview process with all these people with sort of this, look, I don't want to do yet another film on the double slit experiments, which, for those who don't know, is fascinating. It's mind blowing, but it's used commonly to talk about the implications of quantum mechanics or the random number generators. I mean, these studies have been done. Like Garrett Modell says, that we don't want to prove this anymore. It's been proven. And all people have to do is look at the data. Look at the data that came out of the Pear Lab. It's extensive.
It's secret. It's hidden in the basement of the Vatican. But But it's out there.
It's out there, and again, it was an education talking to scientists. And I think that was a huge, important process for me to go through to understand what's happening. So I'm sitting there and we're talking about, some precognition experiments and retrocausation. And most legitimate, so-called legitimate peer-reviewed journals won't publish any of this. And so I brought up this one of these experiments on retrocausation, which is a mind-blowing stuff. You must know about this, where they hook up sensors to a person and they measure galvanic skin response and heart rate and respiratory rate and all these things. And they show people random images on a computer that are either, cuddly bunny rabbits and rainbows and skin kittens and all this stuff and dolphins, or pictures of scary stuff, monsters and spiders and snakes and all that. And sure enough, you're getting an appropriate biophysiological response to the stimuli. But what they started to discover was that the person would start to have the biophysiological response 4 to 5 seconds prior to the stimuli happening. It's amazing stuff. And it's been published and studied and repeated over and over again. All the things that are the hallmarks of science, independent verification, and most scientific journals won't even publish this stuff. So I bring this up in my brother's house with this young scientist, and he Googles it. He's got his phone there, and he brings it up, and it's published in some third-rate, journal of metaphysical nonsense or whatever. I don't know what the name of the journal was. And he just starts hooting and hollering and just sort of completely discrediting it, saying, well, this is just nonsense. But they owned it. It's like what we grew up with communist Russia owning the media. Like the entire scientific community, with their bias towards materialism, owns the entire publishing world. So none of this stuff's getting published.
Well, what I find really interesting is that you came to that 1930s, 1940s date. I've been saying that for a long time. I love reading books prior to 1930 because you have a lot of the original explorers that are going out and talking to indigenous cultures, and they're just, all right, extremely politically incorrect by today's standards, which is kind of funny on some levels, if you can kind of wrap your mind around that. But they just tell you what they're seeing and what they're experiencing, more what they're seeing. They don't really get into themselves. But after 1930s, it changes. There is a huge change in the literature that came out. Huge.
Yeah, and I interviewed a guy by the name of James Strick who's written a book about this just now, and he noticed the same thing. So he went into the history, and to me, the history of science is a phenomenal thing. I could do a whole series of that. It's fascinating. Like I was saying about, if you look at evolution and how things change and how there's such a herd mentality and how the community buys onto something for decades and hundreds of years, centuries, that's not even true, but they just latched onto it. But in the 30s, the money dried up. So you had basically the entire scientific community being controlled by one fund, and that one fund funded things that were reductionist, and that, amazingly enough, altered the course of science going forward, because you had to buy into that, or you didn't get funded. And if you didn't, if you did stuff out of the side, your own science experiments, you were some wacko, and you didn't get published anyway. So it's extremely biased, and it has been for 80 or 90 years.
Pretty scary. And they always say that science, the goal of science is to explore and discover new things, but that doesn't really seem to be the case.
Well, and I left that whole discussion out of the film, which is the whole thing's a mess, in the sense that you have to. It's all grants driven. And my brother, I mean, he spends, 80, 90% of his career for the last 30 years writing grants. It's a 2 or 3 year grant cycle, and you're constantly writing grants. And when you write a grant, you're not inventing or discovering anything. In order to get funding, you have to say in the grant what it is that you're going to discover. How can you discover something if you're saying what it is that you're going to discover? So you have all these incremental steps in the so-called scientific process, and scientists really are more or less just technicians. They're conducting the experiments in the controlled studies, and they say this is what we think we're going to find, and this is the apparatus. We need $1 million to build this, and this is what it's going to reveal. And there's really not a lot of real science going on.
When you were talking to these scientists, did they recognize the role of consciousness in their own lives? Did they recognize that where their inspiration comes from someplace outside of themselves versus from some biochemical process that is happening inside their body?
Yeah, this was also, it's so, I don't want to use the word scary. You mentioned it. No, it's there because you just it's bum, bum, bum.
Yeah, that one.
My kids do that. I love it. One guy, I interviewed, maybe I'll interview him again. He's a great guy. He's a biologist, at UNC in Chapel Hill. I interviewed him, and, great guy, enthusiastic, and he's about 55, 57 maybe. And I got done with the interview, and then he opened up and started talking about all the stuff that you just said. And I was like, wait, why didn't you say any of that in front of the camera? He's like, come on, my career would be over tomorrow. I would never get funded again. I would never get my stuff published. My reputation, which for an academic scientist, they're nothing if not a reputation. That's all they are, as a reputation. And so, yes, there's some percentage of scientists who are sort of closet spiritualists, but they can't really, talk about that in public, and they certainly wouldn't do that on camera. What percentage is that? I don't know. I mean, my base is way too small to come up with any meaningful numbers. But I talked to people at Lawrence Livermore Labs who just hung up the phone on me. I don't want to mention the guy's name, but he was busy taking his wife to the hospital for breast cancer, and the guy that and I was telling him about Bankston. I had nothing to do with his wife, but ironically enough, this guy Bankston could have healed his wife. And yet this guy's hanging up the phone on me, and he wants to go do chemotherapy and radiation and surgery and, just the Western. And so, I mean, I'm assuming it's 60, 70, 80% of scientists really don't look at consciousness in their lives. Science is, all of the big discoveries ever in science have come through intuition, and yet science can never tell you what intuition is.
Well, although they probably use it all the time. I mean, that's the part that makes me laugh.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I don't get depressed about it. I think that, like I said, I'm not sure if it's going to take a class action lawsuit. I think it's not a crazy idea. How do you wake up the scientific community? And, to me, the scariest part is that it's not this. It's that's one thing for the scientific community to be 90% materialistic, but the American public has no clue that the people who are making all these decisions about GMOs, about pharmaceuticals, medical treatments, we have 80,000 chemicals in our houses these days that are made by people. But most Americans have no clue that by and large, the scientific community is mostly atheistic, and they're not really atheistic. They're believers of something that can't be proven, but their dogma is science. And I think the general public would be appalled by what they found out if they realized the people, the gods of the world, the scientists, believe something that's simply not true.
But I'm gonna put a but out there.
Yeah.
How do you know? All right, here's a quantum question. How do you know that in their heart they don't believe all of this stuff, but like your one experience with that guy, they're just not putting it out there because they fear for themselves, more like during the period of the Inquisition, they had all this stuff going on the lowdown, and because they feared that they would, be killed or die, or whatever.
Yeah. I don't know what the number is. I hopefully it's 50-50. I don't know what the number is. I would think that younger people are more inclined to be thinking in spiritual terms, which is why I was so shocked with this really likable, enthusiastic kid in California, and who was just utterly materialistic. It was mind blowing to me. That wow, but this is. To me, it doesn't. The one thing that sort of doesn't matter is this is a temporary situation. I don't know what it's going to take, but maybe it's some documentary film, but something is going to wake up the scientific community, and they're going to have to accept the data from all the studies that have been done. The data is overwhelming. Like Larry says in the film, he thought back in 1984 that the evidence was so incontrovertible, it's going to change the world. And here we are 30 years later. But it's going to happen. Is it this year, next year, 50 years from now? At some point, the scientific community is going to embrace the research and the data from the consciousness studies and have to shift their worldview on reality.
Well, maybe it's not about them shifting. Maybe it's more about them stepping out of the closet.
Sure. I mean, the joke within the scientific, what is it? The Scientific for Scientific Exploration, which is, a group of scientists, 800 in the world that are legitimate scientists who are looking at this any kind of phenomena that are outside the mainstream. The joke with them is get tenure first. If you so. And they get, they'll get, Bankston told me, he'll get young kids come up to him all the time and say, hey, I'd love this. I want to get involved. And he kind of looks at them and he's like, sorry, you're too young. Go get tenure and then come back. Or, go get tenure and do it in the closet. Because in the scientific and the academic world, if you don't have tenure, your whole career is tenuous. You can end your career in a second by being associated and blacklisted by these, woo-woo people.
Uh-oh. Then they better not hang around with me.
It's going to change. I've never been so optimistic about what's happening. And is it going to take, a calamity? I hope not. But something's going to happen, and it's a temporary thing. We've learned a lot from science over the last few years the last few hundred years that we wouldn't have learned any other way. But now it's time to come full circle and look at what it means to be human, from a spiritually centric, from a consciousness centric perspective. We're not happier. We're not healthier because of modern science. This is certainly true. But the happiest and the healthiest people in the world are in third world countries. So that says something right there.
It always makes me wonder why we stepped out of the jungle in the first place. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I love
That's
history.
one of those questions that you just have to leave out there to ponder,
Yeah.
One of the things that I love, one of the other takeaways that I had was a Bruce Lipton comment where, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing it because he said it and then I would kind of process it and then I try to write it down. But I was having problems doing the computer part because I wasn't on my computer watching it. And he made the comment, something to the effect of, where's the information, like the inspiration type information. And and then something to the effect of we download it from the ethers. So do you think that the information, that using it as an example, that there's like an Akashic record out there, and so when we want to learn how to fix something or do something, we just bring that information in from, out there and download it to ourselves to move forward with it?
That's how I lived my whole life. And not in a sense of in a belief structure, or interestingly enough, I lack the ability to visualize. Like, can you see a tiger in your mind's eye, and can you start counting the stripes? I can't see the tiger, which I didn't realize people had this ability until 3 years ago. I thought everybody was like me.
So are you auditory?
Yeah, I'm more auditory, yes. So I can really, I'm not good at making up songs, but I can play songs in my head really well. But the thing is when I'm in a classroom setting, I can't possibly, I'm disabled. I'm like a blind person in some sense. And you know how a blind person, their other senses are more highlighted. For me, because I can't visualize, and I've got a teacher up in the front of the classroom trying to explain something, and using visual, not cues, but visual references, and saying, "Oh, it looks like this or looks like that." I think what happened with me is, my whole life I never even knew this was happening. I had to learn differently than everybody else learns, which is an interesting phenomenon. And my way of learning was, okay. It wasn't, I'm going to Source or I'm going to Akashic Records, but it was just almost like a question. Okay, how do I do that? And then I would do it. I mean, I did these films with 15 years ago, I invented a product 4 years before anyone had heard of Skype or YouTube that did both, and they got bought for a collective $10 billion. I went off and did these films with no practical experience, training, money, or help. I said, okay, I'm just going to go to these films. So I certainly have been able to tap in, I'm no genius. I haven't been able to tap in like some of the greats, but the ability to actually go out there and get information and be inspired by something outside of ourselves this is part of the human condition. And, I think the obstacle has been the mind sitting there saying, well, no, you can't do that. You have to go to school, you have to read it in a book, or, whatever else the ego does to get in the way and interfere with that connection.
My experience, not necessarily my personal experience, but just in talking to people, some of the most creative, out of the box, intuitive people are the ones that, and I'm not meaning this in a derogatory way, but that have some kind of challenge processing information the way that society expects them to process it.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, because, a lot of times in my life, people just have different, and I couldn't, and they treat me like, why can't you just be like everyone else? That kind of thing. It's like, I couldn't think like you if I wanted to. You don't understand. It's not that I want to be different. I just am different, and
but it makes you
that.
not be programmable.
Well, that's why I get fired a lot.
Now we know. This is the job interview. But I want to go back to the little comment about downloading information.
Right.
Okay, so this has absolutely nothing to do with the film. Well, kind of.
Yeah.
But you know what doesn't make sense to me? Okay, so if this information, we put out our intention, and I know for me, if I sit there and I ask the universe to help me solve a problem, I get the answer. I always get the answer. It might take me a few steps, but I always get the freaking answer. Why haven't we cured cancer? Why haven't we dealt with MS? There are all these doctors and institutions that are studying this, and they have to be putting out the intention of, what can I do? And they have to be getting the answer.
There's a lot of quotes in my film, and I use quotes, of course, to break up the talking heads. But one of them is the answers we get are based on the questions we ask. And so if you've got this entire, medical, pharmaceutical, scientific community asking the wrong questions, they're never going to get the right answer. I mean, if anything physical is symptomatic of something happening in our energetic field, and science won't even recognize that we have an energetic field that's innately intelligent and is driving our immune systems and our autonomic nervous systems, they're never going to find that they're looking in the wrong place. And back to what you were saying about the intuition, there's been many scientific studies done on how if your last thought before you go to sleep at night is a question, you'll wake up with the answer to whatever question you had. So this is definitely a documented phenomena that's well known in the scientific community. But and people like Thomas Edison and Steve Jobs and, many people who operate on that realm, certainly have access to a great more information than the rest of the people. Why can't we cure cancer? I think Bankston does a great job of healing cancer. The world's not ready for it right now because it doesn't deal with, it's not patentable. It costs, the great thing about Bankston, I got to tell you, I know we're running out of time here. He's actually working on basically a vaccine for cancer, where we can do another dozen shows. But he started doing these experiments 15, 20, 25 years ago, curing mice, and the details are phenomenal. But it turns out that when he cures a mouse of this metastatic cancer they inject it with, the mouse is cured for life. You can re-inject the mouse and it'll get, it'll never get sick again. And they can actually take cells out of that mouse, inject them into another mouse, and that mouse will be cured for life. So he's actually looking at a human. It's not literally a vaccine, but it's basically a human cancer vaccine that he's going to treat people with for $100. He's actually kind of
we'll hear news stories about him coming up.
Yeah,
you heard it here first. Anyway, Frank, I do know the music's going to come up, and I want people to know if they want to see this new film or any of your films, but the new one is Physics of the Soul. Where's the best place for them to go view it?
The best place to view it is beyondmefilms.com. And I know the audience will love it, but really, I'm really hoping this film can go out into the mainstream. So you can get online and gift the film. If you have someone's email address that you think is going to like the film or get something out of it, you can go and rent the film and put it in their name, and they can watch it and help the film go a little bit viral and really reach the mainstream. So again, that's beyondmefilms.com.
All righty. Frank, thanks so much for coming on. And when the next film comes out, of course, I'll have to be in it and everything, or, one of them. But when the next film comes out, definitely reach out and we will pick up the story, talk about chakras and auras and energy.
Absolutely. And next time I'm in Texas, I'll swing by and conduct an interview. It's a lot of fun. To me, interviewing is just a blast. I love doing it.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you go, and you have a great evening. Wonderful having you back on the show, and I can't wait till next time.
Thanks for having me on, Rita.
All right. Bye, Frank.
Bye. Good night.
That's Frank Hugenard. His webpage is Beyond Me Films. This film is Physics of the Soul. Cool film. Definitely watch it, everybody. And then next week, we have our good friend back on again for a 2-hour show, Nick Redfern. We're going to be talking about secret history, conspiracies, and aliens among us. So until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio.